The history of the automobile is packed with iconic engines that revolutionized driving, but not every engine was a success story. In this countdown, we're exploring the worst car engines ever put into production. From design flaws that left drivers stranded to reliability nightmares that drained wallets, these engines show that even the biggest automakers can make big mistakes. Cadillac HT4100 V8. So, the Cadillac HT4100 V8. It was supposed to scream luxury and innovation, but instead it whispered, "Please, don't push me too hard." Introduced in 1982, this engine was intended to be the heart of Cadillac's downsized models like the Eldorado, Seville, and DeVille. It promised cutting-edge tech like aluminum block construction and cast-iron heads, but Cadillac might have overpromised and, brace yourself, under-delivered spectacularly. If you were wondering why this engine was such a train wreck, let me walk you through its saga of inadequacy. For starters, the HT4100 managed to crank out a feeble 125 horsepower and 190 pound-foot of torque. Yes, you read that right, 125 horses from a V8. To put that into perspective, a modern Honda Civic pumps out more power with half the cylinders. Cadillac owners went from cruising with pride to barely merging onto highways with their tails between their legs. And let's not even get into the oil leaks. Wait, scratch that. We have to. This engine leaked oil like it was auditioning to be a BP mascot. Combine that with an overheating issue caused by poor coolant circulation, and you had an engine that broke hearts and wallets faster than you could say premium luxury. So, what's the cherry on top? The HT4100 had this magical feature called engine death by metal fatigue. The aluminum block and cast iron heads expanded and contracted at different rates, leading to blown head gaskets, warped components, and eventually catastrophic failure. Cadillac sold over 200,000 units with this engine across its models between 1982 and 1987, but you could argue that sold is a generous term. Many customers bought their way into frustration and swore off Cadillac entirely. Here's the kicker, Cadillac tried to spin the HT4100 as fuel efficient, but it guzzled gas while barely moving the car. In the end, Cadillac had to replace the HT4100 with more reliable engines, but the damage to its reputation was done. This engine is a reminder that luxury isn't just about plush leather seats. Your engine actually has to work too. Northstar 4.6-liter V8. Picture this, the Northstar was launched in 1992 with a mission to put Cadillac back on the map as the king of luxury performance. And for a while, it did. Boasting a respectable 275 to 300 horsepower, the 4.6-liter Northstar V8 was a beast on paper. It powered luxury models like the Cadillac STS, DeVille, and Eldorado, even becoming the centerpiece of Cadillac's bold, art and science design era. But what Cadillac didn't advertise was that owning a Northstar was like dating someone charming but completely unreliable. Great at first, but a total headache once you really got to know them. So what was the Achilles heel? Head gaskets. This engine loved blowing head gaskets like some people love binge-watching Netflix. Why? Cadillac used long head bolts that threaded into soft aluminum blocks. Over time, the threads would weaken, causing the head bolts to lose their grip. This led to coolant leaks, overheating, and eventually a repair bill that could rival the down payment on a new car. But wait, there's more. The Northstar also suffered from oil consumption issues. Owners would routinely discover their engines burning through quarts of oil like it was a competitive sport. Cadillac tried to defend this as normal for a high-performance engine, but most owners weren't buying it, literally or figuratively. Despite these flaws, Cadillac managed to sell millions of Northstar-equipped vehicles over its production run, which lasted until 2011. Fun fact, the Northstar powered more than just Cadillacs. It found its way into the Pontiac Bonneville GXP and even the Shelby Series 1 sports car. But no matter where it went, the Northstar's reliability issues followed like a bad reputation you just can't shake. In the end, the Northstar was a shining example of engineering ambition gone wrong. Chevy 305 V8. The Chevy 305 V8 was General Motors' answer to the question no one really asked. What if we made a V8 that's fine? Introduced in 1976 and used across a wide range of GM vehicles like the Camaro, Monte Carlo, and even trucks, the 305 was the little engine that tried, just not very hard. It was designed during the fuel crisis era, so GM focused on efficiency rather than performance. The result? a V8 that could be described as adequate on its best day. Producing around 145 to 170 horsepower, the 305 was about as exciting as a lukewarm cup of coffee. Sure, it got the job done, but it didn't exactly light your world on fire. If you ever wanted to know what an underachieving V8 looked like, the 305 was your poster child. And let's talk emissions. The 305 came out during the era when automakers were frantically adding emissions controls to meet regulations, often at the expense of performance. The result? A choked up engine that felt more like a strangled cat than a roaring lion. Still, GM managed to sell millions of these engines, mostly because buyers didn't have much of a choice. If you wanted a GM V8 in the late 70s or early 80s, odds were you were getting a 305. Interestingly, the 305 had some surprising longevity. It powered everything from muscle cars to workhorse trucks and even survived into the early 90s. But by then, it was hopelessly outclassed by newer, better designed engines. Today, the 305 is remembered not for what it did well, but for what it failed to do spectacularly. Ford 3.8 V6. If engines could apologize, the Ford 3.8 V6 would have written a heartfelt letter to every owner. Introduced in the early 1980s, the engine was meant to power everything from the Ford Taurus to the Mustang and Thunderbird. On paper, it looked decent, a mid-size V6 with enough power to get you from A to B. In reality, it was a masterclass in mechanical dysfunction. One of the 3.8 V6's biggest sins was its tendency to blow head gaskets. Ford eventually issued a recall, but by then the damage was done, both to the engines and to Ford's reputation. The gasket failures were so common that some owners joked about carrying a spare gasket kit in the trunk. To make matters worse, coolant would leak into the cylinders, leading to hydrolocking, which is basically your engine saying, "I'm done, good luck." Despite these issues, Ford used this engine in millions of vehicles over a production run that lasted nearly 2 decades. That's right, Ford somehow managed to keep this mechanical comedy of errors alive until the early 2000s. Why? Probably because it was cheap to produce and people kept buying it, albeit reluctantly. Here's the shocking part. The 3.8 V6 powered not just cars, but also some of Ford's minivans and trucks, including the Aerostar and Windstar. Yes, they trusted the engine to haul families across the country. If nothing else, it proved that optimism knows no bounds. Today, the Ford 3.8 V6 is remembered as a cautionary tale, a reminder that just because you can make something doesn't mean you should. Dodge 2.2-liter turbocharged. One of the most tragic chapters in the history of American turbocharged engines, the Dodge 2.2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. Designed for small sporty cars like the Dodge Daytona, Omni GLH, and Chrysler Laser, the 2.2-liter turbo was supposed to be the engine that delivered the thrill of turbocharging on a budget. Instead, it turned out to be the automotive equivalent of false advertising. While it offered some decent performance like 146 horsepower in its turbocharged form, the 2.2-liter turbocharged engine had a tendency to overheat, especially if you tried to push it even remotely hard. And overheating wasn't just an inconvenience. It led to blown gaskets, cracked heads, and in some cases, complete engine failure. These engines were temperamental at best and unreliable at worst. Owners of these cars quickly learned that if they weren't keeping a close eye on the cooling system, they were going to end up with an expensive repair bill that could have been avoided. Even worse, the 2.2-liter turbocharged engine was known for burning oil like it was an Olympic sport. Owners often reported needing to top off their oil way too frequently, and when you're dealing with a 1980s compact car, that's not what you want. Parts for these engines were also hard to come by, which made repairs even more of a nightmare. Combine all of this with the fact that these cars were, well, not the most comfortable rides to begin with, and you've got a recipe for an engine that should have stayed in the past. Despite all these issues, Dodge managed to sell over 500,000 units of vehicles with the 2.2-liter turbocharged engine throughout the 1980s. Back then, the cars were relatively affordable, around $7,000 for a 1984 Dodge Omni GLH. But what you saved in purchase price, you'd quickly pay for in repairs. Chrysler 2.7-liter V6. When Chrysler introduced the 2.7-liter V6 in the late 1990s, it was intended to be a budget-friendly engine for their lineup of mid-size cars, like the Chrysler Sebring, Dodge Stratus, and Jeep Liberty. At first glance, it seemed like a good idea, affordable, simple, and good enough for your average commuter. What could go wrong? Oh, everything. The sludge monster was born. The 2.7-liter V6's fatal flaw was its inability to keep oil circulating properly. leading to excessive engine sludge. This wasn't a minor issue either. This was the kind of problem that would cause your engine to seize up after just a few years. Imagine investing in a car, driving it for a few years, and then one day it starts running rough and smoking like an old kettle. It's not a fun experience when your engine's life expectancy is shorter than your car loan. By some reports, these engines would have oil sludge build up within 30,000 miles if owners didn't change the oil religiously every 3,000 miles. It wasn't just a few unlucky owners either. Chrysler sold millions of cars with this engine, and those who bought them, at prices ranging from about $17,000 to $22,000, often found themselves facing expensive repair bills well before the car hit 100,000 miles. A replacement engine could cost upwards of $3,500, making it one of those just sell the car and move on situations. Despite this, Chrysler managed to push forward, continuing to offer the 2.7-liter in their models until 2007, which meant they kept selling millions of cars with engines that had the lifespan of a poorly timed firecracker. So, how many were sold? Estimates suggest that Chrysler produced over 2 million vehicles with the 2.7-liter V6. That's a lot of people whose commutes ended with engine replacements or outright breakdowns. Ford 4.0-liter SOHC V6. Ford's 4.0-liter SOHC V6 engine seemed like a solid choice for a variety of vehicles, powering everything from the Ford Ranger to the Explorer and even the Mustang for a short period. While it wasn't exactly a powerhouse, it offered decent horsepower, around 160 to 205 horsepower depending on the variant, for those who wanted a bit of pep in their step without breaking the bank. However, this engine quickly became a classic case of Ford overestimating its durability. While it ran fine for a while, the engine had a tendency to develop a serious problem with timing chain tensioners. When this component failed, it could cause catastrophic engine damage, often leading to expensive repairs. But here's the kicker: Ford's fix was more like a band-aid on a bullet wound. Many owners still experienced issues even after repairs. If you were unlucky enough to have one of these timing chain problems, you could be looking at a repair bill anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000. Ford did sell quite a few of these engines, and they showed up in popular models like the Ford Explorer, one of the most sold SUVs of the late 90s and early 2000s, and the Ford Ranger. Production numbers? It's estimated that Ford sold over 3 million units of the 4.0-liter V6, which explains why so many owners had to deal with the engine's various issues. The price of a 2005 Ford Explorer was around $25,000. But again, you'd probably end up spending that much again in repairs down the road. Ford 3.0-liter Vulcan V6. The 3.0-liter Vulcan V6. Ford's classic case of trying to make a reliable engine while making a completely forgettable one. The Vulcan was Ford's go-to engine for nearly 20 years, showing up in vehicles like the Ford Taurus, the Ford Ranger, and even the Ford Windstar minivan. Now, 20 years of production sounds like a long, successful run, right? Well, here's the thing: longevity doesn't always mean greatness. This engine was known for being more functional than fun, a little like an office printer that always works but never gives you that feeling of satisfaction. It could churn out a modest 145 horsepower, which was fine for the daily commute, but not exactly thrilling if you wanted to drive. In fact, it was so underwhelming that most of its drivers probably wouldn't be able to remember the engine's performance if they were asked about it in a memory quiz. Now, onto its reputation for noise and vibrations. The Vulcan wasn't just a car engine, it was an experience. Drivers often reported that the engine sounded like a lawnmower stuck in traffic. If you had the pleasure of driving a Vulcan-powered Taurus, you'd be treated to the symphony of vibrations that made the steering wheel shake and the seats feel like they were doing their own version of the Harlem Shake. If your daily drive involved long hours behind the wheel, you could count on having numb fingers by the end of it. And while reliability was its saving grace, it had issues when it came to oil leaks. It wasn't uncommon for the Vulcan to leak oil, causing some seriously messy engines over time. So, how many Vulcan engines were made? It's difficult to pin down exact numbers, but Ford's massive production of the Ford Taurus and Ford Ranger, two of the most popular vehicles of the 90s and early 2000s, puts the number easily in the millions. As for the price, a new Ford Ranger would typically set you back about $15,000 to $20,000. However, the true cost was in the maintenance. which often felt like you were paying for the privilege of keeping your car on the road. Pontiac 2.5-liter Iron Duke. Let's talk about the Pontiac Iron Duke, an engine that was as tough as its name suggested. Or was it? The 2.5-liter 4-cylinder Iron Duke wasn't exactly a high-performance engine, but Pontiac tried to make it one of the stars of their 1980s lineup, fitting it into cars like the Pontiac Sunbird and the Chevy Cavalier. What could go wrong? Well, pretty much everything. The Iron Duke got its name because it was built like an old-school steel-cold fighter. Unfortunately, it didn't take much to knock it out of the ring. For starters, it wasn't particularly strong, only producing about 90 horsepower. The engine had a reputation for excessive oil consumption, leading drivers to top off their oil way too often. And while they were doing that, they might have also been dealing with constant vibrations that could rattle your teeth out. But wait, there's more. The Iron Duke was prone to cracking under pressure. In fact, this engine was more likely to fail catastrophically than most of its counterparts. Pontiac had to issue several recalls for the engine over the years due to issues with the pistons and crankshaft. If you got stuck with one of these engines, you might have spent as much time with mechanics as you did on the road. Now, let's talk numbers. How many were sold? Pontiac built and sold millions of these cars, despite the engine's reputation. You could expect to pay around $10,000 for a new Pontiac Sunbird in the early 80s, but the true cost wasn't in the initial purchase. It was in the maintenance nightmares that followed. Chevrolet 2.2-liter Ecotec I4. The Chevrolet 2.2-liter Ecotec I4 engine found its way into cars like the Chevy Cavalier, the Pontiac Sunfire, and the Chevy Malibu in the early 2000s. On paper, it seemed like a reasonable choice, a compact, fuel-efficient engine that could handle daily driving. But in reality, this engine was more like a misunderstanding of what reliable means. Let's start with the fact that this engine was painfully underpowered. At its best, it produced a measly 115 horsepower, and even the sportier versions only managed to hit around 140 horsepower. That's not exactly heart-pounding performance. Picture yourself driving a car with the Ecotec engine. If you ever needed to overtake someone on the highway, you'd probably be watching your life flash before your eyes as you slowly crept up beside them. The biggest issue with the Ecotec was its penchant for overheating. This was a common problem, especially in the early years of production. The engine was prone to head gasket failures, which, when left unchecked, could turn it into full-on engine destruction. Imagine paying for a car that was reliable, only to have it develop a cracked head gasket after just 70,000 miles. In some cases, owners reported engine failures as early as 50,000 miles, and the repair bill was far from friendly, often costing upwards of $2,000 to replace the gasket and fix the engine. But it wasn't just overheating that made the Ecotec a pain. The engine also had some serious oil consumption problems. It wasn't unusual for owners to be topping up their oil every few weeks, with some cars burning through a quart of oil every 1,000 miles. To make matters worse, the Ecotec was a direct injection engine, which meant it was susceptible to carbon buildup on the intake valves. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the engine's tendency to suck down oil and its reliability issues led many drivers to scrap their Ecotec-powered vehicles long before they should have. But despite all this, Chevrolet continued to churn out millions of vehicles with this engine. The total number of Ecotec-powered vehicles is hard to pin down, but estimates suggest that tens of millions of cars, including compact sedans and family cars, were sold during its run. As for the price, a new 2003 Chevy Cavalier with the Ecotec engine would have cost you around $12,000 to $16,000, making it an affordable choice for budget-conscious buyers. But as many owners found out, the cost of ownership quickly added up.